Shutter speed has to do with the amount of time the shutter remains open during the exposure. And like we talked about in the video on aperture, that amount of time depends on how much light comes into the camera. Okay, so the more light coming in, the faster the shutter can open and close. The less light, then the inverse of that as well. Okay, the slower the shutter opens and closes. And that allows us to go through and do a number of things. We can capture motion, or we can blur motion. In fact, the scene that's before you right now, this image of the life flight helicopter, I took this from another helicopter as we were filming. And I shot this at a shutter speed that wouldn't go through and freeze the blades going around, but would give them some motion because I wanted the dynamics of the actual structure of the blades, of both the top rotor and the tail rotor, to come into play with the photograph. And so I chose the right shutter speed to go through and get that. If the actual blades were still, if I shot this at a thousandth of a second, that froze everything, it would look like the helicopter itself would lose flight characteristics, right? It looked kind of funky that way, that it wasn't even really flying. So a lot of this is editorial type. It's up to you in terms of what do you want to go through and represent within the image. And again, as like we talked about in the other videos, how much editorial do we want to get into when it comes to photojournalism? We want to capture what's going on. To invoke the idea of a blur within the image might go through and say something more about the story, or to freeze the image to where we see all the detail will also go through and indicate something on that. For the last number of years, it's been over 20 years, I've been shooting in Zion Canyon. And when I first got my Fujifilm XM1, I went out and did a number of exposures. One was a slow one to go through and get this kind of blurred water on the Virgin River coming around the Court of the Patriarchs in the middle of winter time. And so this is a slow exposure. It's probably about 3 seconds long. That's been done with some neutral density filters to allow then the aperture to stay open long enough to get, or to stay open to go through and get the type of depth of field we have in this. So the shutter speed manipulation, the slower the shutter, it gives us this velvety kind of smooth look to the river that way. The flip side of that, in a situation where there wasn't a lot of light to begin with, and but I wanted to capture motion. I wanted to freeze motion in a way. Was at a lantern festival out in the Mojave Desert. So this was shot with the same camera, and the only existing light that I'm using here is light that's coming off the torches inside of these lanterns. And so I had to up the other variable, the ASA ISO, the sensitivity of my chip, to what I can't remember. It's probably about 1800 ASA ISO. So I could shoot this fast enough at about a 60th of a second, 1/25th of a second, to freeze the action of the lanterns actually moving. All those lanterns are moving, and they're moving relatively quickly as well, that you see in the background. So there's a trade-off here. The faster I want to go, then I need to open up my aperture, and so I'm trading up depth of field within this. But this is a wide angle lens, and my depth of field trade-off wasn't too terribly bad because of that in terms of its focal length. Watch for a video on focal length. We'll get into that too later on in the semester, all right? So here are two situations: a daylight situation where I have plenty of light, but I limited that light so I could slow the shutter down. And here I have a nighttime situation where I don't have a whole lot of light, and I was able to go through and open up the aperture enough and to pump up the ASA ISO enough to go through and get a shutter speed that would go through and freeze the action. Photography is a trade-off between those three axioms of photography: between your shutter speed, between your aperture setting, and between your sensitivity setting. One last image, and I'll leave you with, I got a few more to get into to explain some things. This was done camping out up in the high Uintas. And this is an exposure that took over 30 seconds to go through and capture. And my daughter and I were sitting there in complete darkness, okay? Some ambient light was filtering around. We also had a very small campfire going on, just a single flame, just kind of still getting the last bit of a log that was on the fire. And we could see a few stars up in the firmament. And I thought, I wonder what that would look like if we did a long-term exposure on that. And so I put the camera on a tripod. I pointed it upwards here. This is a 50 millimeter fast lens on a 1.4. and I release the shutter for 30 seconds here. And what you see there is the firmament of the sky. It's all the stars that our human eyes don't see. And the trees surrounding that were the trees that were in complete darkness. These were illuminated by that little flickering flame. Yeah, it's pretty amazing, huh? Working with shutter speed opens up a completely different world for us to go through and see what's going on. So I have some shots here of my camera. I just took these right before I started this tutorial to go through and show you. On the interface then of this, at the very bottom line, you see the M, you see that transparent bar, and there's a dial and a 100 and an F0, and then over to the right you see an an ISO 400 and then the battery indicator. Something needs to be explained here. The F0, since I have a manual lens on this camera, the camera itself cannot electronically pick up what the aperture is at. Okay, so that's why it says F0 there, in case you're wondering. But what we're focusing on here, pardon the pun, is the is the shutter speed setting here. The black bar on top of that shows the range of shutter and where my camera is currently situated. So if I turn that knob represented by that blue knob by the M, if I turn the knob to the left, it goes to 80th of a second. If I turn it to the right, it goes to 1/25th of a second. So what you see here on the left-hand side in my vertical light meter, okay, I'm just a little bit above an exposure for that. And as I as I slow the speed down, like to a 60th of a second, you see I've gone to a full stop overexposed. And I'm going to slow it one more stop down to a 40th of a second, and I'm almost 2 stops overexposed. That's the relationship then. So I could have done the same thing with an aperture and created or delineated my depth of field going on here, shooting out of this little kitchen nook into the actual kitchen here in my house. Both of those would have resulted in terms of an overexposure. You're not really seeing that represented within the camera itself. I didn't release a shutter to show you what the picture would actually look like. But my point being, you manipulate how fast you're recording light in the camera, it's going to affect your exposure. The whole concept of exposure, like I explained in the first video, is getting everything lined up to go through and say, this is the depth of field I want, and this is the shutter speed that I want. They come together in order for me to reach a perfect exposure. One of the test questions you had, actually 2 or 3 of them you had on the test question, gets into that whole concept in terms of, well, if I up my sensitivity or if I stop down, what does that do to the rest of my exposure, and how do I compensate for that? Again, there'll be a couple of exercises for you to do over the course of this class. This becomes important to understand because, like dealing with our depth of field, if we can also go through and tweak what's happening in terms of objects passing through our frame and give them a sense of motion, they go through and start to tell a completely deeper type of story. And that's why we have these axioms at our fingertips. So next up is a clip on sensitivity. So be sure to watch that one as well.